The train whistled one last time before it vanished into the burning horizon, leaving only a trail of smoke and a single woman behind. Clara Bennett stood alone on the wooden platform of the Dry Creek station, her gloved hands gripping a small carpet bag as if it held the last of her courage. The wind blew dust into the folds of her ivory traveling dress, the one she'd stitched herself back in Missouri. It was supposed to be her wedding dress. Now beneath the bruised light of dusk, it looked more like a ghost of a dream that had already died. For 2 days and nights, she had traveled across the country, from the green hills of St. Louis to this sun-cracked edge of nowhere. She'd answered an ad in a newspaper. Rancher seeks respectable wife. Must be of strong character. Room, board, and security provided. The letters had been kind, the handwriting firm, and the man, Mr. Joseph Harlan, had promised her a new beginning. After her father's death and her stepmother's cold indifference, Clara had believed a man out west might be her salvation. But now the platform was empty, and the only sound was the creaking of the station sign swaying in the wind. The station master, an old man with tobacco stains on his beard, had waited with her for a while. As the sun sank lower, he'd muttered, "Ain't no Harlan come this way in weeks. Might be he changed his mind, ma'am." Then he'd tipped his hat and trudged off, leaving her to the coyotes and her heartbreak. The last train smoke faded into the sky. The silence pressed down heavy. Clara felt the first crack in her composure. She'd imagined her groom arriving on horseback, perhaps shy but kind, perhaps taking her hand with a steady warmth that said, "You're safe now." Instead, the prairie stretched endlessly, indifferent to her tears. A tumbleweed rolled across the tracks, and even that seemed to mock her. Her heart twisted with shame. What would people say back home if they knew she'd been left like this? A bride without a groom, a woman without a place. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the faint pulse beneath her corset. "You'll be fine," she whispered to herself. "You've always managed somehow." But her voice trembled. The evening deepened into violet, the air cooling fast. The smell of dry earth and sage drifted around her. She considered taking shelter inside the abandoned station office, but fear held her still. Every shadow seemed alive. Every sound, the rustle of brush, the cry of an unseen bird, reminded her how far she was from civilization. Then, faintly, she caught movement at the far end of the platform, a tall figure standing half in the light, half in the gathering dark. Her first instinct was alarm. Out here alone, a woman was as vulnerable as a lamb among wolves. But as the figure stepped closer, she saw not menace, but quiet observation. He was an Apache, or so she thought by the blanket draped around his shoulders, deep red and black patterns catching the flicker of the lone lantern. His hair was long, tied with a strip of leather, and his posture was straight as the horizon itself. His eyes, dark amber under the brim of dusk, met hers briefly before lowering to the ground. Clara's breath caught. No one had ever looked at her that way, not with hunger, nor with pity, but with something older and heavier than either. Understanding. He said nothing at first, just studied the train tracks as if listening to the earth itself. Then in low, careful English he asked, "You wait for someone?" The words were simple, yet his voice was deep and soft, like the murmur of distant thunder. "Yes," she whispered, "but he isn't coming." The man nodded once, his face unreadable, and then he looked toward the rising moon. The silence that followed didn't feel empty anymore. For the first time that evening, Clara realized she wasn't truly alone. Not in this strange land, not under this endless sky. And though she couldn't explain why, the sight of that silent Apache standing guard at the edge of her despair steadied something deep within her heart. The faint, flickering hope that perhaps fate had not abandoned her after all. The first stars pricked the violet sky when Taza, the Apache man, finally moved closer. He walked with the deliberate quiet of someone who had spent his life reading the land. Every stone, every ridge, every whispering wind was familiar to him. Clara instinctively took a small step back, clutching her carpet bag a little tighter. Her pulse fluttered, a wild bird trapped in her chest. But there was no threat in his approach. The firelight from the station's lone lantern caught on the edges of his blanket, tracing red and black patterns that seemed to ripple with life. He stopped a few paces away, tilting his head slightly, as if he were measuring her presence, weighing her soul against the vast desert night. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a low wooden crate near the tracks. His voice was calm, not commanding. There was a weight to it, a quiet authority that made it hard to refuse. Clara hesitated. Trust did not come easily to her. Yet something about him, maybe the unwavering steadiness in his eyes, made her obey. She perched on the crate, her hands folded tightly in her lap while he squatted opposite her, the blanket falling around his shoulders like a cloak. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was full, pregnant with possibility. "You're far from home," he said at last, and Clara recognized the words as more than observation. They were acknowledgement, the kind of recognition that sees a person in full, not just their outward appearance. I came for a husband," she admitted. The words tasted bitter like ashes on her tongue. "But he didn't come. He left me." Taza's expression did not change, yet there was a depth in his gaze that seemed to reach inside her, brushing against the raw edges of her fear and disappointment. "Men make promises," he said softly. "Some keep them. Most do not. But dawn always shows their truth." Clara swallowed. His words were strange comfort, not the hollow platitudes of well-meaning strangers, but a profound acknowledgement of the cruelty of life and the endurance of those left behind. Somehow in this remote station, with the desert wind playing through the wooden beams, she felt seen. Truly seen. Do you live here?" she asked, desperate for any bridge to normalcy. "I travel," he replied. "I come back to this land because it is mine, and sometimes because I know those who wander need a place to stand, even if just for a moment." His honesty was like a pulse of warmth in the cold night. Clara found herself relaxing, her hands loosening their grip on the carpetbag. She had never met a man like this before. Not refined or courtly, not polished or charming. He was blunt, grounded, and untamed, and somehow that felt safer than the polished manners of the East. Taza shifted slightly, producing a small bundle of dry grass and kindling. "We can make fire," he said. "It will help with the cold." Clara nodded, surprised by her own willingness to accept his help. Together they built a small blaze, the flames flickering gold and orange against their shadows. She noticed the scent of sage that clung to him, an aroma of the land itself, of distant forests and wide-open plains. They sat in silence for a long while, neither speaking nor needing to. The desert night wrapped around them, and for the first time that evening Clara felt a fragile peace. She didn't know this man's name, his past, or even whether she would ever see him again, but in the quiet, under the wide sweep of stars, she felt the tentative stirrings of trust. Somewhere deep in her chest, a small ember of hope sparked. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't entirely alone. Perhaps there was someone who could stand with her at the edge of the world, someone who understood what it meant to be abandoned and yet still endure. And in that moment she realized. The night was long, the prairie unforgiving and the world full of emptiness. Yet beside this silent Apache stranger, she felt for the first time that survival might not have to be a solitary affair. The night deepened, stretching its shadows across the dusty platform and into the desert beyond. Clara had lost count of the hours she'd spent beside the small fire Taza had built. The flickering flames cast long dancing shapes across the wooden beams of the station, blurring the line between the real and the imagined. She realized she had been talking to him not in full sentences or stories, but in fragments, little confessions she hadn't shared with anyone in years. I've never been this far west," she admitted, her voice soft as the wind through the nearby mesquite. "Everything is so open, so endless, and yet somehow I feel smaller than ever." Taza nodded, watching the flames as if they held the memory of centuries. "The land is wide, yes, but it is patient. It can carry more than you think. You only need to learn its rhythm." Clara blinked, unsure whether he meant the desert or life itself. Yet the clarity in his amber eyes made her stop questioning. There was a confidence about him that suggested he knew more than he revealed. She felt a strange pull, an acknowledgement that though they came from completely different worlds, they shared a common loneliness. "You speak English well," she said, trying to bridge the gap between them. He shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "I learned it, so I could understand travelers, so I could hear those who are lost. And tonight, perhaps."
"I meant to help one." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks.
There was no condescension in his tone, only honesty. It unsettled her and, oddly, comforted her all at once. She realized she had been conditioned to see men of his kind as threats, as figures from newspapers and tavern rumor, but standing here, With him quietly tending the fire and speaking in low, deliberate tones, she sensed nothing of the danger she had imagined. They shared small stories, simple truths about their lives. Clara spoke of Missouri, of the riverboats, of her father's sudden death, and the oppressive silence of her stepmother's household. Taza listened, never interrupting, never judging. When he spoke, it was of the desert. The way storms rolled over the hills, the scent of sage after rain, the sound of water flowing in a dry riverbed. He told of his travels, of the tribes and towns, of nights spent under stars that seemed endless. At one point, Clara laughed quietly, startled at herself. She hadn't laughed in days. The sound felt foreign, fragile, and yet it warmed the space between them. Taza's eyes softened, and for the first time he smiled, faint but genuine, revealing a hint of amusement at something she had said. It was a small gesture, but it made her chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. Trust, or perhaps the very beginnings of hope. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the desert wildflowers from the hills beyond. Taza tilted his head, closing his eyes for a brief moment, listening. "The night carries truth," he said quietly. "It tells you what is important. It strips away what is unnecessary." Clara's heart raced. She realized he wasn't speaking to the land this time. He was speaking to her. The weight of the night pressed upon her, the knowledge that she had nowhere else to turn, yet somehow she didn't feel fear. Instead, she felt a strange sense of safety, the kind that only comes when someone else has silently promised to watch over you without words. For a long while, they sat in silence again, watching the fire burn low. Two worlds, hers of structured towns, railroads, and rigid expectations, his of open plains, shifting winds, and survival in the harshness of the frontier, had collided in this one fragile space. And in that collision, a tenuous understanding began to form. Though they came from different lives, different customs, and different expectations, they could meet here, in this moment, and find common ground. As the stars wheeled overhead, Clara realized she no longer felt entirely alone. The desert was still vast, the night still dark. But she had found something she hadn't anticipated, a companion, a silent protector, a stranger whose presence made the empty station platform feel less like abandonment and more like the beginning of something unknown. She didn't yet know what that something was, but for the first time since leaving Missouri, she dared to imagine that her journey had not been wasted. The collision of their worlds was messy, uncertain, and fragile, yet it was alive. And life, after all, often began in the most unexpected places. The desert night was colder than Clara expected. Even beneath her travel dress and shawl, the chill seeped into her bones, settling like a stone in her chest. Taza, noticing her shiver, rose and moved with deliberate ease, gathering dry brush and kindling from the dusty platform. The fire he built was small but steady, its flames flickering gold and red against the shadowed boards of the station. Clara watched him silently. There was something mesmerizing in the way he worked, his movements precise, efficient, and unhurried. He was clearly a man accustomed to the land, to surviving alone in harsh conditions. Yet in his presence she felt no fear, only a cautious curiosity. She had spent her life in controlled environments, parlors, boarding houses, and quiet town, and here, in the open desert with a stranger, she felt her boundaries both tested and gently respected. When the fire was finally established, Taza stepped back and gestured toward the glow. "Sit," he said. "It will warm you." Clara hesitated for only a moment before accepting the invitation, lowering herself onto the worn platform near the fire. The warmth spread through her body, a welcome comfort against the desert's bite. For a few moments they simply watched the flames together, neither speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. The silence was not empty. It carried the weight of two lonely souls, unspoken acknowledgement of shared isolation. "I didn't expect anyone to help me tonight," Clara admitted softly, her voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire. "I thought I was truly alone." Taza's amber eyes met hers briefly. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "help comes when you least expect it, and sometimes it comes from those you never thought to trust." Clara considered this. In all her life, she had been taught caution, suspicion of strangers, and obedience to social hierarchies. Yet here, with Taza, none of those rules applied. He had not offered her advice or condescension. He had simply provided warmth, a safe place to exist for a few hours. There was a purity in that gesture, one that reached something long dormant in her heart. "You travel far?" she asked, trying to bridge the silence with words. Taza nodded. "Yes, the land is wide, and I must know it. The plains, the rivers, the hills, they all have lessons if you listen." His gaze flicked to the distant horizon. "And sometimes I travel to see who else might need a place to stand." Even for just one night, Clara smiled faintly, realizing that he spoke as one who had seen much of life's cruelty, and yet chosen not to harden completely against it. There was a weight in him, a history she could not fully grasp, yet she felt the resonance of shared understanding. He too had been left behind, perhaps abandoned by circumstance or by people he had trusted. She drew the blanket around her shoulders, feeling its warmth seep into her. It smelled faintly of smoke and sage, earthy and grounding, unlike anything she had known before. She hesitated for a moment, then kept it. He offered it freely, without expectation or ceremony. A simple act, yet one that carried more intimacy than any words could convey. Hours passed. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced across their faces, highlighting the contrast between their worlds. She was from a world of formalities and fragile comforts. He was from the open desert, unbound and steadfast. And yet for this one night they had met halfway, connected through something more essential than background or tradition. Shared survival, human warmth and mutual recognition. Finally, as the embers glowed softly, Clara spoke again, her voice a whisper. "I didn't know nights like this could exist, even in a place as harsh as this." Taza's gaze softened, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "The desert has many faces," he said. "Some are cruel, yes, but others carry fire, even in the darkness." And for the first time since stepping off the train, Clara felt that fire, not the flames before her, but something deeper, a fragile, tentative warmth between two strangers who had, in a single night, shared more than they could have imagined. In the silence of the desert, the fire became more than light. It became a bridge. Two worlds, two hearts began the delicate process of meeting, one cautious step at a time beneath the vast, indifferent sky. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, casting a gentle, flickering light over the worn wooden platform. The desert night stretched on, endless and silent except for the occasional rustle of dry grass in the wind. Clara felt her eyes grow heavy, the exhaustion of travel and anxiety pressing down like the weight of the earth itself. Yet she could not sleep, not fully. Something about the stillness, the vast emptiness of the land, and the steady presence of Taza beside her kept her alert, on edge in a way that was neither fear nor discomfort. Taza shifted slightly, his movements quiet, careful. He leaned back on his hands, his blanket falling loosely from his shoulders. The amber of his eyes reflected the remaining sparks of the fire, glinting like distant stars. For a long moment he said nothing, and Clara wondered if he ever truly rested, or if silence was simply his companion, as it had become hers tonight. Then, in a voice as low and deliberate as the desert wind, he spoke. "Will you hold me till dawn?" Clara froze. The words were so unexpected, so intimate that her heart nearly stopped. She stared at him, unsure how to respond. It was not a plea, not a question born of desperation, but something quieter, steadier, an offering, a challenge, and a confession all at once. It was as if he was asking her not merely to sit with him for a few hours, but to share a fragile, unspoken trust. Her throat tightened. What could she say? She barely knew him, a stranger who had appeared out of the shadows yet somehow felt more real than anyone she had ever known. Her life in Missouri had been structured, controlled, and predictable. Here in the wide-open desert, all of that structure dissolved, leaving only the raw, undeniable present, the fire, the stars, the man beside her, and the pulse of life that throbbed between them. Slowly, almost instinctively, she leaned closer, not out of obligation or politeness, but because the desert, the night, and this moment demanded it. Her head brushed lightly against his shoulder. He did not move, did not speak, yet the pressure of his presence seemed to fold around her, protective and steady. For the first time that evening, Clara allowed herself to simply feel. Not fear, not doubt, not loneliness. She felt warmth, human and grounding. She felt trust, tentative, delicate, but undeniable. And in that silence, in the shared quiet beneath the stars, she understood something essential. She had been abandoned before, left to face the world alone. But she was not truly alone now. Taza spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Night is long. Darkness is heavy, but it is lighter with another by your side. Even for a while, Clara pressed closer. She did not need to answer with words. Her presence, her stillness, the way she allowed herself to be held said more than any sentence could. He shifted slightly to accommodate her, careful not to startle her, careful to respect the fragile trust being offered. The stars wheeled overhead, uncountable and eternal, casting silver light across the desert floor. The wind whispered through the mesquite and sage, a soft lullaby for those brave enough to listen. And beneath that vast sky, two strangers, from different worlds, different lives, different expectations, shared a single quiet communion. Hours passed. The night's chill began to retreat with the promise of dawn, but Clara scarcely noticed. Her heart had found a rhythm in the presence of Taza, steady and sure, a rhythm that promised something she had not dared hope for: continuity, care, and perhaps even the beginnings of love. When the first pale streaks of light crept across the horizon, she realized she had not slept, but she was not weary. Instead, she felt alive in a way she had not since leaving Missouri. He had asked for a single night of trust, and in granting it, she had discovered the courage to face whatever the desert and life might throw at her next. Taza's hand, resting lightly near hers, seemed to echo the sentiment. The night had passed, and though the darkness would return again, they had weathered it together. And in that small, unspoken bond, Clara knew that the question beneath the stars was more than literal. It was a promise, a test, and the beginning of a journey neither of them could yet imagine. The first tendrils of sunlight stretched across the desert horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The night's shadows retreated reluctantly, leaving the platform of Dry Creek Station bathed in a soft, forgiving light. Clara opened her eyes slowly, the warmth of the fire replaced by the gentle radiance of dawn. For a moment she stayed still, savoring the quiet and the unspoken promise that had lingered through the night. Beside her, Taza remained seated, leaning on one hand, his eyes trained on the horizon as if reading secrets written in the shifting sands. When he turned his gaze toward her, there was a softness there she had not fully seen in the darkness, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared night, the trust and the comfort they had found in one another. "You've held me through the dark," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of both gratitude and truth. "Now you've seen that night is not so endless. You'll never fear it again." Clara's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the realization of what he meant. Night, the desert, her loneliness. All of it had seemed insurmountable, unending. Yet here she was, still intact, still present, and not quite alone. She allowed herself to smile, a genuine curve of lips that had been scarce in recent days. I feel that," she said softly, her words barely rising above the gentle rustle of morning wind through sagebrush. The desert seemed to hold its breath around them, acknowledging the rare intimacy of this dawn. Taza shifted closer, not to impose, but to share space, a silent camaraderie forged in the trials of night. Clara realized how much the past hours had changed her perception of him, not simply as a stranger, not merely as a protector, but as a man whose presence had begun to mean something profound. This light. "It always comes," Taza continued, his voice more reflective than commanding. "No matter how long the night or harsh the desert, dawn arrives. And with it, choices, decisions, life moves forward." Clara considered the words, feeling their resonance deepen. She had been given no choice in much of her life. Her father's death, the arrangements made for her, the long journey west. But here, in this quiet hour, she had agency. The night had tested her, and she had endured. The dawn was a reminder that she could now decide what came next, that she could step forward with courage rather than hesitation. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching the horizon blush with light. Then Clara spoke, the words deliberate, steady, carrying a new strength. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, or where I'm supposed to go. But I know I don't want to face it alone." Taza's amber eyes softened, and for the first time a small, rare smile touched his lips. "You will not," he said simply. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The station was quiet now, the desert waking slowly around them. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth, mingling with the faint trace of smoke from their fire. It felt as if the land itself had acknowledged the bond formed in the night, fragile, unspoken, yet undeniable. Clara realized that the platform where she had felt abandoned now felt like a place of beginning, not an end. As the sun crept higher, Taza rose, offering his hand. Clara took it without hesitation, feeling the firm strength in his grasp. For the first time since she had arrived in this desolate town, she felt steady. Her heart, her spirit, her will all aligned with a sense of purpose. "Come," Taza said, motioning toward the tracks and the open plains beyond. "The world moves forward. So must we." Clara nodded, letting the warmth of the dawn and the steadiness of his presence fill her. Together they stepped from the platform, leaving behind the shadows of the night, carrying the lessons of trust and resilience into the rising sun. The desert, vast and indifferent, stretched endlessly before them, yet for the first time, it seemed less a place of danger and more a canvas for possibility. And in the early light, Clara realized the truth of Taza's words. Life would move forward, dawn after dawn, and now she would face it not alone, but with a companion who had proven himself through both darkness and light. In that quiet promise of sunrise, the future began, and fragile, uncertain, yet full of hope. The sun had fully risen over the desert, casting long, harsh shadows across the weathered buildings of Dry Creek Station. The air was already hot, the wind carrying the faint scent of dust and sage. Clara and Taza had walked a short distance from the platform, their steps silent on the dry earth, when the distant sound of hooves rattling over rock and sand reached their ears. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the rising dust cloud and saw the silhouette of a wagon bouncing along the trail, the familiar shape of a sheriff's wagon unmistakable against the bright morning sky. Her chest tightened. The wagon rattled to a stop near the station, and a man with a broad-brimmed hat and dusty coat swung down. His badge gleamed in the sun, a symbol of law and order in a place where law often bent to the highest bidder. He carried the air of authority, but also the subtle arrogance of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Bennett," the sheriff said, his voice carrying across the small clearing. "Word came from your intended husband. Seems he's changed his mind about taking you in." Clara's stomach sank. The man she had hoped would provide security and companionship, her mail-order fiancé, had abandoned her, confirming her fears in a single sentence. She clenched her fists, trying to hold back the anger and humiliation that rose like flames. Taza remained silent, standing a little behind her. His amber eyes were steady, unreadable, yet the calm confidence in his posture was enough to anchor her trembling thoughts. The sheriff's gaze flicked to Taza, and for a brief moment his smug authority faltered. "And who's this?" the sheriff demanded, nodding toward Taza. "Some savage you've picked up off the prairie? You best keep your distance, ma'am. Men like him don't belong in towns like ours." Clara felt a flash of indignation. For so long she had been taught to defer to authority, to obey without question. But now, standing beside Taza, a man who had kept her safe through the night, who had offered her warmth, trust, and protection when no one else had, she felt a fierce surge of loyalty. "This man has done nothing but help me," she said, her voice clear, carrying a new strength she hadn't known she possessed. "He kept me safe when no one else would. He is not your concern." The sheriff bristled. "Careful, ma'am. You might think you're free to choose, but this town doesn't take kindly to disrespect." Taza stepped forward slightly, but his movements were measured, calm, and deliberate. He did not draw a weapon, nor did he speak immediately. His presence alone, tall, steady, unshakable, seemed to shift the tension in the air. Clara felt her pulse slow, the sense of safety returning even as the sheriff's unease grew. "Miss Bennett," Taza said finally, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority, "you are not beholden to this man nor to his laws. You choose your own path. You choose who stands with you." Clara's heart swelled. The truth in his words resonated deep within her. The desert night, the fire, the long hours of quiet trust had all led to this moment. She realized that the bond they had formed was not just fragile hope. It was tangible, unyielding, and stronger than the superficial rules imposed by the townsfolk or her absent fiancé. The sheriff, recognizing that he could not intimidate either of them, muttered something under his breath about law and order, and left the wagon clattering back down the trail. The dust settled, leaving only the desert, the station, and the two of them. Clara exhaled slowly, relief washing through her. She turned to Taza, her eyes meeting his. There was no need for words. The night had tested them. The dawn had strengthened them. And now the outside world had confirmed what she already knew. He was the one she could trust. As the morning sun climbed higher, they moved away from the station together. Clara walked a little taller, her steps steadier, knowing that she had survived abandonment, weathered danger, and claimed her own agency. Beside her, Taza remained unwavering, the desert wind tangling their hair and brushing against their clothes. Together they faced a world that had sought to dictate her future, and for the first time, she understood that her destiny was no longer someone else's to determine. The station, now empty save for the echoes of the sheriff's departure, became a memory rather than a prison. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, and for the first time, Clara felt the thrill of freedom, tempered by trust, guided by courage, and shared with a companion who had proven, without a single word of coercion, that he would stand by her side. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of golden dust and scrubby sagebrush under the relentless morning sun. Clara tightened the straps of her bag across her shoulders, feeling the firmness of Taza's hand briefly brush hers as they walked. Every step carried the weight of departure, leaving behind Dry Creek Station, the whispers of townsfolk, and the ghost of a fiancé who had abandoned her, yet also the fragile thrill of freedom. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, her voice cautious, though she trusted Taza enough now to ask. "North," he replied simply. "The mountains, the streams and valleys that no one else bothers to claim. There you can breathe. There you can begin anew." Clara considered this. She had spent her life in structured rooms and predictable routines, and now she was stepping into a vast, untamed land with a stranger who had earned her trust in a single night. The notion was terrifying yet exhilarating. For the first time in years, she felt the thrill of possibility, the pulse of adventure, the hum of a life she might actually choose for herself. They rode in silence for hours, Taza guiding her along dusty trails that wound around low hills and past craggy cliffs. Occasionally he spoke, pointing out landmarks or noting signs of wildlife and water. His knowledge of the land was meticulous, his awareness absolute. Clara followed closely, marveling at how seamlessly he navigated the desert, reading the earth like a story written in dust, rock, and wind. At noon they paused by a shallow stream, its cool water sparkling like diamonds in the sunlight. Taza dismounted first, offering Clara his hand. She accepted it, her fingers brushing against his, and for a moment they stood side by side, gazing at the clear water and the small oasis it created in the otherwise harsh landscape. "You must be thirsty," he said, producing a leather canteen. Clara took it gratefully, the water sharp and sweet on her tongue. She had not realized how parched she had become, not just in body but in spirit until this moment of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the words hold more weight than usual. They were not just for the water, but for the warmth, the trust, and the protection he had offered through the night and into this journey. Taza's gaze lingered on her, steady and unflinching. "We travel together," he said simply. "No one will force you back. No one will dictate your path. Here the land is yours to claim, and I will stand beside you." Clara felt a surge of gratitude and something deeper, a nascent sense of belonging she had never felt before. In Missouri, she had been guided by expectations and obligations, by the judgments of family and society. Here she was guided by choice and companionship, by a bond forged through hardship, quiet understanding, and shared survival. They resumed their journey, following the stream until it disappeared into a narrow canyon. The road grew steeper, rocky, and more challenging, yet Clara found herself strengthened by Taza's presence. When she stumbled on loose stones, his hand was there, firm and steady, helping her regain her footing. Not once did he scold or urge. His assistance was simple, dependable, and affirming. As evening fell, they made camp near a small cluster of juniper trees. Taza built a fire with practiced efficiency, and Clara gathered brush to keep the flames alive. They ate in companionable silence, the taste of roasted venison and bread grounding them after a day of travel. That night, under the sweep of endless stars, Clara lay beside Taza, the warmth of the fire mingling with the quiet security of his presence. She thought of the station they had left behind, of the abandoned promises and false expectations, and realized that each step into the frontier had stripped away another layer of fear. By the time she drifted into sleep, she understood that the road away was more than a physical journey. It was a path into freedom, into trust, into a future shaped not by abandonment, but by courage and the choice to embrace life with someone who truly cared. The desert around them was harsh and unpredictable, but for the first time she faced it willingly, knowing that Taza's steady presence would guide her through both night and day. And in that quiet, she knew that the road ahead, uncertain, rugged and wild, was theirs to travel together. The days in the high desert passed with a rhythm that Clara had never known. Each sunrise brought a new challenge: rocky trails, sudden storms, and the harsh glare of the sun, yet also a new discovery: the steady presence of Taza, unwavering, patient and attuned to the land in ways she could scarcely comprehend. Their companionship had grown silently, almost imperceptibly, but it carried a weight that neither could deny. One evening, as storm clouds gathered over the jagged cliffs of a canyon, they found shelter in a natural alcove, carved into the rock by centuries of wind and rain. The sky darkened quickly, and soon the first rumbles of thunder echoed through the canyon walls. Taza moved to gather brush, while Clara huddled beneath her blanket, feeling the first chill of approaching rain. "You're not afraid, are you?" he asked, his amber eyes flicking to her with curiosity. Clara shook her head. "Not of the storm," she admitted. "Of being here with you." Her words surprised even herself. She had thought fear had no place when someone she trusted stood beside her, yet the vulnerability of the canyon, the howling wind and the roar of distant lightning made her acutely aware of her dependence and her trust. Taza nodded, kneeling beside her. "The storm is temporary," he said. "It comes, it passes, and life continues. Like everything else, it can be faced together." Clara's hand brushed against his, and for the first time since she had met him, she let herself linger in the contact. His hand was warm, firm, grounding. There was no rush, no expectation, only presence and the quiet assurance that she was safe. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with something wholly new: desire tempered by trust, emotion tempered by respect. The storm hit with sudden force, rain lashing against rock and earth and lightning illuminating the narrow canyon in stark, fleeting flashes. Clara clutched the blanket tighter around herself, but Taza remained calm, placing his arm lightly across her shoulders. "See," he murmured. "Even in the wildest storm there is shelter." Hours passed. The fire they had kindled flickered in the alcove, throwing shadows that danced across the walls, the canyon echoing their quiet breaths. Clara realized that she had never felt so intensely alive. Every sensation, the pounding of rain, the scent of wet earth, the heat radiating from Taza's body, the faint thrill of proximity, sharpened her awareness of herself, of the present, and of him. In a rare moment of stillness between the cracks of thunder, she looked up at him. "Taza, what are we doing?" Her voice was barely audible, carried by the roar of the storm. He smiled faintly, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "You are learning that trust can be more powerful than fear, that companionship can be stronger than solitude, and that hearts, even when forged in hardship, can endure." Clara's chest tightened as understanding settled over her. They were more than traveling companions now. The night, the storm, the shared trials of desert and canyon had shaped a bond deeper than she had dared to imagine. She leaned toward him, her forehead resting against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. It was a rhythm she recognized now, familiar and comforting, a measure against which she could calibrate her own courage and hope. The storm, finally, passed, leaving the canyon glistening, washed clean, and smelling of wet stone and sage. Rainwater dripped from the alcove roof, and the first slivers of moonlight pierced through the receding clouds. Clara lifted her head and looked at Taza, a faint smile on her lips. I think I'm beginning to understand," she said softly. Taza's amber eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "Then you know," he said simply, "that whatever comes next, we face it together. Our hearts have endured the fire, and now, they are ready for whatever life offers." As the night settled, over the canyon, Clara felt a certainty she had never known, that love could grow in the unlikeliest of places, that trust could be forged in adversity, and that together, they could face the vast, untamed West and each other with courage, hope, and the strength of hearts bound by shared trials. In the flickering light of their fire, beneath a sky stretched wide and infinite, two hearts had been forged, unbreakable, enduring, and ready to meet whatever dawn might bring. The morning broke quietly over the hidden valley, painting the desert hills with soft gold and amber. The sky, a vast expanse of pale blue, seemed almost infinite, as though the land itself was holding its breath for the new day. Clara stepped from the small tent they had erected near a cluster of juniper trees, stretching her arms as the cool morning air brushed her face. She breathed deeply, savoring the scent of sage and wet earth. Here, in this remote sanctuary, the world felt both wide and safe. Taza appeared beside her, as steady as the land itself. He had already tended the fire, the smoke curling lazily into the morning sky. His amber eyes met hers, and for the first time, Clara allowed herself to fully absorb the comfort of his presence. No words were necessary. The bond they had forged in the night, in the storms, and along countless miles of dusty trail had spoken far louder than any promises could. They walked together down a narrow trail toward the valley floor. The hidden community of Taza's kin was a small cluster of adobe homes and open fields, tucked away from prying eyes and the judgmental whispers of distant towns. Children laughed. In the distance, the sound startlingly joyful after months of Clara's solitude. The air was alive with life, birdsong, rustling leaves, and the faint tinkle of livestock bells, a world far removed from the loneliness of Dry Creek Station. Clara's thoughts drifted back to that first night on the platform, to the long hours beside the fire, and to the question Taza had asked under the stars, "Will you hold me till dawn?" She realized now that it had never been about a single night. It had been a challenge, a test, and a promise, a way of asking her to trust, to step beyond fear, and to embrace life in its rawest, most beautiful form. She turned to Taza, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand now what you meant that night." His gaze softened, a faint smile touching the corner of his lips. "And?" he asked gently, the simplicity of the question carrying more weight than any grand declaration. "I will," she said. "Not just then, but now. Always." Taza's hand found hers, fingers curling around hers with an ease that spoke of comfort, strength, and certainty. The warmth of his touch grounded her, rooting her in this new world they had chosen together. The journey west had been perilous and uncertain, but in that moment, Clara knew they had arrived, not just at a physical place, but at a space of safety, belonging, and mutual respect. Days turned into weeks. Clara settled into the rhythms of the hidden valley, learning the land, the chores, and the traditions of Taza's people. She was no longer the abandoned bride left at a station, no longer a traveler at the mercy of strangers. She was a part of something enduring, a life built on shared trust and quiet devotion. Taza remained her guide, protector, and companion, yet their bond had grown into a partnership of equals, forged in fire, distance, and the trials of the untamed West. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Clara and Taza stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The sky was ablaze with color, pinks, oranges, and deep purples blending into the first hints of night. She leaned against him, head resting on his shoulder, and felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a constant she could rely on. "We've come a long way," she said softly. "Yes," Taza replied, his voice carrying pride, gratitude, and something deeper, the quiet contentment of a man who had found his place in the world and the person with whom he wished to share it. and the road still stretches ahead, but we face it together." Clara smiled, feeling the weight of past fears dissolve. The desert had been harsh, unforgiving, and often cruel, but it had also been a teacher. It had brought her to this moment, to this man, and to the understanding that true strength comes not from solitude but from the willingness to trust, to endure, and to love. As the first stars began to pierce the twilight, Clara realized that she had finally found her home. Not a town, not a house, not a promise on paper, but a life shared with someone who had proven, through silence, through storms, and through the journey itself, that they could face the wildest nights and the harshest days together. In the hidden valley, under the sweep of infinite sky, Clara and Taza stood hand in hand, ready for whatever the future might bring. And for the first time, she understood that some journeys, no matter how long or treacherous, lead not just to a place but to the person you were meant to find along the way. The new dawn had arrived, and with it a life full of hope, love, and endless possibility.